Welcome back, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, Florence has asked me to make a very brief announcement. I'm sure most of you have been extremely well behaved and have registered beforehand. If you have not, could we ask you before you leave to go to the desk and leave your email address so that we can inform you about any future events of the center that you might want to attend. We promise we won't spam you with lots of stuff. It is my very, very great pleasure to introduce Loraine Obler. Loraine is the Distinguished Professor in the program in Speech, Language and Hearing Sciences and Linguistics at the City University of New York at the Graduate Center, and she also runs the Language in the Aging Brain Lab at Boston University. Loraine got her PhD originally from Michigan University, but since then, the list of very prestigious honors and prizes that she has amassed has become more and more impressive. It includes, among a lot of other things, 2 honorary doctorates, one from Turku and one from Stockholm University, and several Fulbright Awards. If that hasn't impressed you, the list of research grants that she has been awarded certainly would, but if I began enumerating them, we'd probably still be here tomorrow. And if I even began on her list of publications, that would take us safely into next week before she even got a chance to say a word. So I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to say a more personal thing. I was talking recently with 2 of my PhD students about when you're a young scholar who just starts in the field, how daunting it can be to come up against all of these big names that you've been reading the work of, and then you're standing face to face with them and you're just completely overwhelmed. And we were also talking about how almost invariably these very grand people are really, really nice. We weren't talking about Loraine at the time, but we might very well have been. I remember the first time I met Loraine was at a conference called La Langue Maternelle, a rather odd conference in many ways. We can talk about that over the reception if you want to hear more, in Paris. And I was at the time at a relatively early stage of my own PhD. And I remember how tongue-tied, although that might seem rather unlikely in my case, but I was quite tongue-tied and very, very starstruck at the time. But there really are very few people that I've ever met who are as genuinely warm and approachable, interested in everybody, whether they're a Nobel Prize winner or a BA student, as Loraine is. And that, to me, really is the hallmark of a truly great scholar. Loraine is best known for her work on language disorders, in particular on aphasia and on language and aging, also mostly among multilingual speakers. This is also what she will be talking about today. Please join me in welcoming Loraine Obler.
Thank you so much, Monica. Do I want to put it on? I know what I want to do. I want to point you to the 4th person in this picture here. I'm going to bring her into focus today. This woman here, right? So, I feel a tremendous obligation, responsibility for all the language changes that are associated with healthy aging that you may not know about. As I look around the room, we're a relatively young average age. And I took on the added reasons for optimism as a subtitle because the last time I gave this talk, I had a relatively older population of people, and they began getting pretty uncomfortable. Actually, I was only talking there about the language changes of what I call healthy aging, and nevertheless, they were looking dissatisfied. So I thought this is a good opportunity for, particularly when the word used by the center is language loss, to look for some positive aspects as well. You'll see if you agree that I have found some in the course of this talk. So when we say language loss in older adulthood, it's phenomenologically diverse. I was going to try and say it's phenomenologically diverse, which is a treat for any researcher. Neurolinguistics theory, after all, is built on the comparison of impaired and spared language abilities. and their links to the brain regions or the networks subserving them, the sort of dissociation that Stephen was talking to us about this morning, comparing child language and adult language. Of course, these types of language loss I'll be talking about can be distressing and depressing to those who experience them, and for those who love these people who are experiencing them, and those who care for them. And to some of us in the audience who are approaching later life and looking in that direction. So, when I use the term, I've taken on the challenge, as I said, to think about reasons for optimism. I do want to note that it's actually not always language or loss, in Chomsky's sense of language competence, that I'll be talking about. Rather, these are often problems with language performance, in his sense, and the good piece about that is it means they're potentially treatable with speech therapy. I do submit when semantics itself declines in the dementias, it does appear to be language competence that is impaired, but I'll be interested in your thoughts on that. I also want to note that my focus is virtually entirely on changes in monolinguals. I had to cut the bilinguals out. That's for another workshop. There's a reference or two in there, but I'm trusting that you will talk about second language attrition, first language attrition in particular, your area of focus. There is lots more I want to remind you to be said about bilinguals and multilinguals, but they all share, presumably, more or less, the same language changes associated with healthy aging. So in this talk, I will talk first about language in the aphasias, then about language in Alzheimer's dementia, the most frequent one, at least in the Western world, then about language in the primary progressive aphasias, which are only recently beginning to be talked about, a pretty rare phenomenon, but an interesting one that's really on the border between aphasia and dementia. Then I will turn to the findings in our lab on language in normal aging, and conclude with the reasons for optimism and a slide about directions for future research without wanting to give away everything we plan in the lab. So, language in the aphasias. How many of you know someone with aphasia? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, well, those of you who are speech-language pathologists, I'm not surprised. But I was surprised to learn the datum I'm about to tell you about how frequent aphasia is. Namely, 1 in 250 people, at least in the US. How about dementia? How many of you know somebody with dementia? Much larger group. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, and as our society changes and people are living longer, there is more and more dementia, and there are the various types. So, back to aphasia. Aphasia results, as some but not all of you know, from stroke, most commonly these days, or an accident, tumor, brain injury. The average age of people with aphasia, when I last looked into it, which I grant was in 1978, was about 56. And 11 other centers around the world looked into issues of age as it relates to aphasia type, and they found the range was in the 50s to very early 60s. That's, of course, for averages. People have aphasia as young as childhood and young adulthood and all the way into the 80s and 90s. You probably will have heard the name of Broca, who in the first half of that decade that was so exciting in neurology, talked about Broca's aphasia and discovered the region of the brain by 1865 in the left hemisphere linked to difficulties with producing speech. And you probably also heard of Wernicke, who in 1874 pointed out there was a very different sort of aphasia that we today call Wernicke's aphasia. Now, these regions are Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and the link between the two of them that Wernicke postulated existed and then found a patient who exactly had the problems that would demonstrate this link existed, are associated with the classic model of brain as it's organized for language, well into the 20th century. Today, however, we see many more regions, particularly of the left hemisphere, that are involved in language of healthy individuals, younger individuals, as well as older individuals. Classification of aphasia is done in two ways. The first is by the phenomenology. So in Broca's aphasia, I'll give you a clip in a minute of a woman with Broca's aphasia. Production of speech is difficult, including production of what we may call grammatical elements, those functors that link the substantives, nouns and verbs, into sentences. And comprehension is relatively spared. In Wernicke's aphasia, by contrast, the opposite is seen, a nice dissociation here, or a double dissociation in a sense, because there's the dissociation within Wernicke's aphasia, comprehension is impaired, production is relatively spared, and then there's the double dissociation because the opposite is seen in Broca's aphasia. So let me show you the picture that the woman with Broca's aphasia is describing, because if I just let her describe it to you, you wouldn't be able to fully envision this picture. It's called the cookie theft picture from the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Exam. As I said, the picture of language in mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease is, wrong way, very similar to that in the patient with Wernicke's aphasia you just saw. So here's a patient I saw that we talked about in our article on speech monitoring skills in Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and normal aging. And he said, and this is then the cookie theft picture, the same picture you saw before. Yeah, it looks like this is very simple. So there's a full sentence, right, but a pretty empty one. Well, here the kid's in a chair that's going to crash if they don't look out over here, and here's mama wiping dishes. Oh, what else is there to it? This is called a paragrammatism, because it's not an omission of a functor element, but an addition of one. So let me then continue to talk about the languages in the aphasias. There are different sorts of aphasias linked to different regions in the brain. There can be problems with phonology, as the first woman had a problem with producing the consonant cluster initially. Lexical retrieval, we certainly saw a lot of empty terms in the second guy. Morphology is the one that's interested me over the years, and differently across different languages, depending on how dense their morphology is. Grammar, we call it agrammatism. There are problems with comprehension and or production, often both, but disproportionately one compared to the other. And in oral and or written modalities, again, usually both, but you can find particular dissociations where only one of them is impaired. Now, there are not problems with pragmatics in people who have aphasia. Their eye contact is good, their ability to converse, I say something, they say something in response is good. Of course, there are problems if you can't understand what the person said to you, but nevertheless, you got the conversation back and forth. Self-monitoring can be very poor, particularly in the patients with Wernicke's aphasia, but pragmatics overall, you get some formulaic language, depending on how you define pragmatics. So if the issue is inference, you're not going to see good inference in patients with aphasia for the language reasons. Bilinguals, by the way, who have aphasia, or monolinguals, are very good at language choice. So you know how even a 3-year-old bilingual can appropriately speak language A to one person and B to another, and A and B to a person who speaks both of them. That's preserved in aphasia, for the most part. The second type of classification is by severity. So there's a type of aphasia I haven't mentioned yet called anomia, where the primary problem is, I'm stopping as if I was looking for a word. I happen to know what I want to say next. The primary problem is finding the words you're looking for. Usually turns up either on a naming test or in discourse. In the middle, we have Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia, which can be more or less severe themselves. And at the most severe, we have global aphasia, where both comprehension and production are severely impaired. The good news, I told you I was looking for the good news, is aphasia is a disorder of language, not intelligence, as the American Aphasia Association has for its motto. Some people with aphasia recover totally. They tend, I grant, to be children or young adults, as a rule. And many recover somewhat with therapy, and some even without, depending on the regions of the brain that have been damaged, the extent of the damage, and the time post the damage that we study somewhat. So I'm going to switch from aphasia now to language in Alzheimer's disease. By contrast, Alzheimer's disease shows a progressive decline. There's cognitive impairment in conjunction with language and communication problems. And I think you probably noticed, as I did, that throughout this morning's talks, cognition and language are now heavily linked, more as they should be, because they are in our brains, more in some studies and less in others. But you'll certainly see that motivates a large part of our work on healthy aging and language. So in the early stages of language in Alzheimer's disease, patients have problems with naming. Of course, healthy older folks do too. These tend to be on the lower end of those. And some, but very slight, problems with semantics. Sometimes they're in hearing and making sense of words they know. They have difficulty comprehending complex materials, listening to this lecture and telling someone back what it was about, for example. And there is breakdown of some pragmatics already early on, say, repeating stories without acknowledging that you're doing so. There's also the concurrent non-language cognitive problems, problems of memory especially, problems of executive control functions like attention are seen in the early stages already in language and Alzheimer's disease. By the mid stages, as I said, the language and communication looks like that of Wernicke's aphasia. There are problems with naming many specific items. There's fluent, empty speech with a lot of indefinites and non-words, as Vanita Chand and Asila, whose last name I don't have in my head, presented in their poster just outside. Non-words as well can be seen on that. There's little or no self-correction, a major difference between patients with Alzheimer's disease and healthy older folks. Healthy older folks actually make more speech errors, but we correct them all. People with Alzheimer's disease don't necessarily catch or make their self-corrections. Problems comprehending not only sentences, but also words. There's more pragmatic breakdown. So, for example, there are people in this stage of Alzheimer's disease who will revert to using the first language, which isn't predictably happening in the aphasias, but in Alzheimer's disease is what predominantly happens, maybe 95% of instances, even if they're speaking with an interlocutor who they have reason to know doesn't know that language. So the cookie theft picture you remember, and this I have shown you before as typical of Wernicke's, but also of mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. In the late stages, by contrast, there's very little speech produced. What is produced is mostly formulaic. How are you doing? Fine. I was once sent to test a patient when I was a research assistant who was supposed to have Wernicke's aphasia, and she was supposed to move objects around on a board. And I would say, take the man and move him behind the tree. And she would say, that's lovely. And I would say, no, take the man and move him behind the tree. And she'd say, very nice. In retrospect, I understood that she did not have Wernicke's aphasia, she had dementia. Appropriately conversing with me, but, and she was not in the late stages, but moving in that direction, because she initiated very little speech. There's little evidence of comprehension in patients with late-stage Alzheimer's disease, and only the simplest pragmatics are spared, eye contact, specific formulae like very nice. Now, Alzheimer's disease, unlike the larger lesions associated with aphasia, Alzheimer's disease is associated with characteristic neurofibrillary plaques and tangles, as Alzheimer himself pointed out in 1907 and 11. And these result in atrophy. Are you ready to be scared? I'm going to show you. Left hand is the normal brain, and the right hand is the atrophy seen in Alzheimer's dementia in the later stages. So regions of the brain involved in language, this is the temporal lobe in the normal brain, the temporal lobe in the patient with Alzheimer's disease, and in memory are particularly affected. In this picture, it looks like there's overall atrophy, and there is in a sense, but there are areas of the brain that are particularly likely to be affected, as I will continue to talk about soon. So, this atrophy is in particular regions bilaterally, meaning both hemispheres of the brain, even though we've known for a long time from the aphasia literature that it's the left hemisphere that's primarily responsible in 98% of right-handers, which means most people, and even 30% of left-handers. The left hemisphere is responsible for language, but the characteristic changes result in atrophy bilaterally in frontal lobes, responsible for those executive control functions, temporal lobes and parietal lobes. And on the inner part of the hemispheres, medially, as well as on the outer parts that I've shown you pictures of before. So this is the lateral view. And these are the areas, albeit in a right hemisphere here. The temporal lobe is particularly atrophied. The parietal lobe is particularly atrophied. And the frontal regions are particularly atrophied. And this is the medial part of the right hemisphere. This is the lateral part of the right hemisphere. The medial part shows also substantial atrophy in the temporal lobe, the ACC, and part of the parietal lobe. So the good news about Alzheimer's disease is by the middle stages, patients aren't aware of their problems. That's good news for the patients, not necessarily for the family members. Another piece of good news is onset is relatively late in life, later than in aphasia. So a certain smallish percent of the population in the 60s, a somewhat larger one in the 70s, in the 80s. The population is larger than I would like to anticipate, as in the 90s. And I think it's good news that medications are being developed that may counter Alzheimer's disease or slow the decline, which is one of the effects that speech-language pathologists, therapists who are working with these patients also work to do. I turn then to a third phenomenon or set of phenomena associated with aging, the primary progressive aphasias. These are forms of dementia that start exclusively as language problems. So it's because they start as language problems, they're considered aphasias, but because they invariably progress to dementias, they're considered dementias. And they do start relatively early. In the 50s and 60s, we see these language problems. Pick actually described them early in 1892, but they, as frontotemporal dementias is what he was calling them. And these early neurologists spent a fair amount of time not analyzing the language, but simply describing the language of their patients. So it's fascinating to go back and read, particularly Alzheimer and Pick in this regard. Then Mesulam in the late 1980s, I should say, brought back this discussion about primary progressive aphasias. So there are three subtypes. Most people would classify them today. The one that has a G after it is actually called agrammatic or non-fluent. The one that has an S after it is semantic. And the one that's called logopenic, meaning difficulty with words, finding words, has the L after it. And these are of interest in the ways they share commonalities both with aphasia and with dementia, but are also distinct from them in the progression of the disease. So a student of mine drew up this chart comparing Alzheimer's disease, non-fluent primary progressive aphasia, semantic aphasia, and logopenic primary aphasia with respect to the phenomenology, auditory word comprehension in both Alzheimer's and semantic dementia. Auditory sentence comprehension, equally problematic in both. In fact, I think I mentioned before, you'll see that this line exactly is the same as the Alzheimer's disease line. By contrast, syntax, I wonder if you can even read these, probably only those of you who are close to the front. Syntax, morphology, and phonology are impaired in the non-fluent primary progressive aphasia, more like Broca's aphasia. And in logopenic primary progressive aphasia, it's naming and word finding that are particularly impaired, although those are problems as well in Alzheimer's disease and semantic PPA. So I now have a clip for you because the question is, how do we know if someone has simply a naming problem or a semantic problem? And the answer is going to be, if you only have a naming problem, you can't find the word. There's an example of a paraphasia. You can't find the word, but if someone gives you a cue, you can get it. Healthy elderly folks are particularly good at that. And you know what the item is. If it's an item or the concept, you know what it is. If we can give you a way to test it. For example, if I say toothbrush to you, you can do like this, right? Or telephone. You hold it up like that. One, they're very rare. I put rare, but very rare is what the American Association of Alzheimer's Disease says. And two, people are cognitively relatively spared for the first 2 or so years. That's why they're language is impaired, and therefore they're of interest to neurolinguists and other researchers. So let me turn then to talk about language in healthy aging. My whole goal, sometimes I start with this, I was tempted to today, my whole goal is to make language changes in healthy aging look relatively good and not as problematic as the forms linked to brain damage. The good news, I'll tell you right from the start, is there are substantial inter-individual differences. That is to say, there are 70-year-olds who perform like 30-year-olds or 20-year-olds on any of the language tasks that we give, but I'm going to generalize. I'm going to talk about the average person, and there are declines in two arenas. The stereotypes of aging are that we forget names, right? Difficulty hearing, by which people often mean understanding. It's not just hearing differences that could be repaired with hearing aids. Telling stories over and over, and if bilingual, reverting to the first language. And I've already said that while two of those are consistent with what we actually find, the other two are associated with the dementias, the telling stories over and over again without any acknowledgement that you are, and if bilingual, reverting to the first language. So, another piece of good news is there are other aspects of language that don't change with advancing age. Phonology doesn't change, morphology doesn't change, syntax doesn't change, automatic speech, naming the days of the week, for example, or numbers, doesn't change. Vocabulary actually, in some groups, increases. That's a change. That's a good one. And pragmatics, a lot depends on how you define pragmatics, but there's relatively little compared to the dementias. Relatively little change in pragmatics with advancing age. So it's naming or lexical retrieval that does change, and not just for names, but for certainly all substantive classes of words, and comprehension or sentence processing as we've looked at it. And I say again, it's not clear that language itself is changing, rather the processes of language performance change as a result of underlying changes in cognition that supports language and the brain. So in our Language in the Aging Brain Lab, we created a model at the start of our grant 2 funding cycles ago, where we look at age on the one hand and lexical retrieval and auditory comprehension on the other. And we figure they're mediated by health. I'm not going to talk a lot about health today, but I'll refer to one or two of our studies, which is itself linked to hearing and vision, and cognition. And we look at, there's something called cognitive speed. Older folks slow down on pretty much any cognitive task you give. I was going to say them, but I should say us. Executive functions, those control functions that help us organize what we do with the world, in the world, and plan what we do with our brains and in the world. Working memory. Those are the primary ones we look at for their links to lexical retrieval problem and auditory comprehension problem. We actually expanded out to look at brain regions when we had funding to use MRI and structural MRI to ask which regions of the brain, because by now we could predict which ones should be linked to better and worse language performance with advancing age. And then I'm just going to flash briefly through how for each of these functions we were looking at, we had several different tests so that our findings would not be linked just to one test for each of, say, concept formation, set shifting, output monitoring, and inhibition. So I'll start with comprehension, sentence processing. Here's a joke. 3 old guys are out walking. One of them says, "Windy, isn't it?" Second one says, "No, it's Thursday." I put this for non-native speakers of English. Third one says, "So am I. Let's go get a beer." Now, this seems to be linked to hearing problems, right? But there's the hearing, and then there's the construing in a way that makes some sense, wrongly so, what you hear. And it's that construing that also shows decline in advancing age apart from hearing. So, it's not our focus. What we do is control for both pure tone average and speech discrimination scores. And we did a test of speech perception and noise in our first study of this. We saw a progressive decline in comprehension in noise from the 30s through the 70s, so already decline in the 50s, except for sentences that were high predictability, like the rose bush has a lot of thorns. What was the last word? I'll have to do it a little less noise overlay. The rose bush has a lot of thorns. Thorns, thank you. And no noise overlay, right? 70s looked like the 30s in that condition, but in the rest you see a parallel decline with age. We created an embedded sentence test, a couple of tests, where we had subject-relative clauses. The firefighter that rescued the toddler opened the window. Object-relative ones, the toddler that the firefighter rescued opened the window. Control sentences and fillers. And we expect, because other people have found it, that object-relative are going to be the most difficult to comprehend. We had our participants simply judge whether they were logical or not. So it's more likely that the firefighter was opening the window, say, than the toddler was, because toddlers don't open windows. And in fact, we found that it's the object-relative sentences for everybody. In this study, we're testing only older adults from age 55 to 90. It's the object-relative sentences that are hardest for everybody, and there's an increasing decline with advancing age from 55 to 90. And when you looked at response time, did I say that was accuracy? That was accuracy. And when we look at response time, we see almost exactly the opposite. That is the task that takes the condition of sentences that takes the longest for everybody and increasingly becomes slower with advancing age is the object-relative sentences. So more and less complex syntax influences this problem that older adults have with comprehension in advancing age. Now, because we were looking at and interested in the cognitive underpinnings of the language problems, I'm not with, what was his name? The guy who said effectively this morning, Stephen Edelson, was it? That language is an epiphenomenon of cognition. I don't believe that, but I do believe to do language, to perform language, we need underlying cognitive abilities, working memory. That shouldn't surprise us at all. I need to be attending to what I've just said, to correct it if necessary, or to be ready to say what I'm about to say. So we have a simple test of month ordering. Suppose I say to you, I wouldn't write it down, I'd just say to you, please recall the following in the order they occur in the year. March, January. You're supposed to say January, March. And then I say October, May, November. You know the answer, right? And then I go on to 4 and 5 and 6. And by 6, your working memory is overloaded. It's not easy to get them all and work with them to get them in the right order. More interesting to my mind, because it's surprising to me that it links to comprehension abilities, is this test of set shifting. So there's a trails A, and in trails A, you have to draw a line from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Everyone can do that, no errors. In fact, there are no errors in healthy folks on this task, but this task, trails B, is start with 1, draw a line to A, then go to 2, then to B, then to 3, right? You see how it can be a little complex because you need to be monitoring with your executive control functions what it is you've just done and what it is you're about to do, and switching back and forth between the two tasks. It turns out this ability on this task is linked to your performance on that hardest sentence, the object-relative condition in the embedded sentence task. So people who were both high on, darn, I thought I had the other test. So this is verbal working memory. This is the months of the year. People who are both high on verbal working memory and high on set shifting performed the best on their percent accuracy on the object-relative condition. And the people who were low on both verbal working memory and low set shifting were by far the worst performing at every age, with a decline in aging from 55 to 85. We were trying to make it hard for ourselves. It's easy to find age differences if you compare 30-year-olds and 70-year-olds, or college students and 70-year-olds. But if you look within from 55 to 85 or 90, it's not so easy to find changes, and yet in these particular tests, they're not hard to see at all. So, comprehension of difficult, complex structures declines with advancing age, especially in difficult conditions. I'll remind you what those would be in a second. And performance is linked to cognitive functions. Working memory and set shifting are the ones that turn up most often in our studies. Those difficult conditions include noise in the environment. This is a wonderfully quiet space, isn't it, that we're sitting in? But when we're out there having a conversation, not so easy, disproportionately hard for those of us who are older. Speeded speech. One of our studies, we had someone who spoke 200 words a minute, and we didn't know it, but we realized our older adults were complaining about how fast she spoke on the tapes she'd created for us. Little redundancy, low predictability items, and distorted speech over phones, for example. Did you know? Differently for mobile phones and for landline phones. You don't get all the speech information that's coming in from the mouth of the person who's talking to you, and therefore it's harder for older folks to listen to distorted speech, not only for the hearing reasons, but also for posterior regions of the brain changes with advancing age. Lexical retrieval I could talk about for an hour itself, but I won't. Yes, the illustration. An elderly couple had dinner at another couple's house, and after eating, the wives left the table and went into the living room. The two men were talking, and one said, "Last night we went out to a new restaurant. It was really great. I would recommend it very highly." "What's the name of the restaurant?" "What do you call that flower, you know, the one that's red and has thorns?" "Do you mean a rose?" "Yeah, that's the one," replied the man. He then turned towards the living room and yelled, "Rose, what's the name of that restaurant we went to last night?" So, that's an example of the lexical retrieval problems older adults face, and again, I stress some, but not all. When we originally reported on them with a sort of course study, we said it looked like the precipitation and naming problems started with 70 and above. In a later study where we had 3 years of longitudinal data, we were able to find slight changes, but progressive ones, starting already at age 50. And in the figure I'm about to show you, the peak performance on a naming task is age 38. So how you test naming lexical retrieval is you show pictures. Say for nouns, we use the Boston naming test. High frequency items, I don't even have to test you on. Low frequency items, sometimes non-native speakers of English don't know, but I told you, in our studies we're looking at monolinguals for this healthy aging work. Protractor, that took me a while to get to, but palate I remember. And then we created an action naming test for verbs. So we have some high frequency items and then low frequency items. And this one I figure should be a little more high frequency in England than in the States, but some people can get it in the States too. So this is what our findings look like. And you see there's a real decline in naming, the Boston naming test. So Boston naming test is going to be the dotted blue and red lines here. These are the nouns. These are the verbs. We've divided them by gender here, which I don't really want to talk about today. Does this mean verbs are easier to name than nouns? Conceivably. It could also mean that our verbs are easier to name than the BNT nouns, right? The parallels are really more striking than anything else. My favorite line, so this line is a list generation task that as a linguist I don't think of as very natural. Name all the animals you can. You see there is a decline with advancing age on that task. My favorite line here, of course, is this one. That is increase in vocabulary with advancing age for individuals who are relatively low educated. For those of us in this room, higher education, we have a maintenance, at least on the vocabulary test that we used, which is from the Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale of vocabulary. I assure you, since I've been in England, I've already learned some new words, like cafetiere, for example. To me, they're new words. So, is the age-related lexical problem motoric? No, which could be an aphasia. Is it semantic? No, because the participants recognize the correct word and they can demonstrate the meanings. Is it phonological? Well, in the following sense. The difficulty is finding the phonological shape of the word, and cueing helps. Is it listed to this task I've told you about? Confrontation naming? No. Lexical retrieval problems in discourse, we see also people using generic nouns and light verbs disproportionately as they're older, and it's less severe. And there's also, that is to say, lexical retrieval in discourse is less severe than on the confrontation naming task because you have all sorts of ways of compensating. There's also difficulty with idiom retrieval, but that too can be helped by cues. Those would be single word cues. So we asked about the brain regions associated with successful naming and healthy aging. We had 23 normals in our lab, and we gave them both the Boston naming test and the action naming test, and we tested both response time and accuracy, because healthy folks are pretty accurate, but response time can discriminate. And what we see is that if your left hemisphere regions outside the language area are particularly robust in the frontal lobes and in the inferior temporal lobes, and substantial regions, both within the language area and beyond the what would be the language area if it were the left hemisphere. When they're more robust, individuals are better namers. So what this tells us is that substantial right hemisphere robustness was linked to successful both noun and verb retrieval, suggesting compensation from frontal areas bilaterally from the right hemisphere. Now, there's a notion of cognitive reserve you've probably heard about in the media. It's been linked to education and even more saliently to bilingualism. People who are bilingual tend to, by Bialystok et al.'s findings and a few others as well, to have a later onset of dementia if they're going to get dementia, later by 4 to 5 years. So by starting my conclusion, I want to talk about the reasons for optimism in healthy individuals. There are inter-individual differences in healthy aging. Some people in their 70s are as good as some in their 20s and 30s. Good health, I haven't really talked about those studies of ours, but hypertension, but not diabetes, was linked to better naming in our participants. And the two of them, hypertension and diabetes, you know what, I just implied something wrong. Not having hypertension was linked to better naming in our healthy elderly. And not having either hypertension or diabetes, whoa, this is a logical one like yours this morning, and not having both of them also, is also linked to better naming. So health was, to my surprise, linked to performance, but it shouldn't be, because health influences our brains. More education does too, so we're all on the right track with that. And compensation appears possible. Right hemisphere and frontal executive control regions. We don't know the extent to which that's strictly compensation, the extent to which it may be some plasticity, which people now know doesn't, end at age 13 in some critical period, but continues to a lesser extent with advancing age. So the reasons for optimism in aphasia, you may recall, were only 1 in 250 people get aphasia. Many recover somewhat, some altogether. Speech-language therapy can help both language and communication. Reasons for optimism with respect to dementia. Alzheimer's disease is usually of late onset, 70s and later. More education can delay it, as can bilingualism, as can good health. And primary progressive aphasia is very rare. The future directions for research that I think are most salient to me at this time, at least, the ones I would want to get into, are looking at second language learning in older adulthood. So as people start reading the newspapers about how bilingualism is good for you and can ward off dementia, at least for some years, I've seen myself, I used to be a good language learner, and then when I was 43, I was the worst in the class. Granted, the class only had 2 people in it, but I wasn't used to being at the bottom of the class. And the guy teaching us wanted to meet in a cafeteria, and it was too noisy for me to hear the differences already at 43. But there are people who are successful second language learners in older adulthood, and I plan to find out who they are and what their brains are like. The brain mechanisms underlying breakdown of semantics in Alzheimer's disease and primary progressive aphasia, particularly the semantic ones. And I'm talking about the brain mechanisms. So no longer just the regions, but what the actual brain mechanisms are. Perhaps not in my lifetime, but in the next 50 years, we should, God willing, know those. And why older people with aphasia are more likely to have fluent aphasias. So when I told you the average age of people with aphasia is 56, what was fascinating to us was that the average age for people with a non-fluent aphasia type was 53, and the average for people who had the fluent Wernicke's type of aphasia was 63. And people around the world at these 11 centers were finding this same phenomenon. And we looked into what might explain it, going into the Harvard Stroke Registry to see if you got different types of strokes in different areas of the brain with advancing age, and we haven't been able to resolve that, and in my head, I would like to resolve that as well. So I want to thank those students and colleagues who've helped me with the materials I talked about and actually presented today. And I want to thank the National Institutes of Health and the Veterans Administration for funding us since 1976, pretty much all the time. And I want to thank you as an audience, and I want to give best wishes for the center as it is launching itself into the world. Thanks.